Wilma was dying of bone cancer and wanted to die to avoid additional suffering. Some Iowans favor a death with dignity law, which would allow that choice. Others believe we should not have such a law. Should a dying patient be allowed to choose death?
The ethics flower blooms, then it grows. Don't you know how you go?
Since I've never heard James Rachel's argument against euthanasia, today I'm going to explain the argument and you'll see my first reaction to it. Let's begin with the distinction between active and passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia is when you actively take the life of a dying patient. So you might give them a double dose of morphine, knowing that that's going to end their life. Passive euthanasia, on the other hand, is when you allow a dying patient to die. In other words, say a dying patient begins to die and you have a do not resuscitate order, so you don't pull out a fancy machine to maintain their life. You allow or let them die. Active euthanasia is when you actively kill a dying patient. So, for example, if Dr. Bradford gives an extra dose of morphine to Wilma to take her out sooner. Passive euthanasia is when you let a dying patient die by not doing anything to resuscitate them. So imagine Wilma requests do not resuscitate, so that if she begins to die, the doctors have orders not to pull out some fancy machine to revive her. Now there's one more distinction it might be worth making, and that's the distinction between voluntary and listen, maybe that's a little bit too much. I think it's weird to have us both on the screen at the same time. So, okay, thanks. So, voluntary and non-voluntary euthanasia is the distinction we'll look at now. Now, whether it's active or passive euthanasia, there's going to be an issue if it is voluntary or non-voluntary. Voluntary euthanasia is when the dying patient requests it. In other words, she expresses consent. Remember, Wilma requested that Dr. Bradford put her down. Non-voluntary euthanasia would be when the dying patient is unable to express her wishes. For example, if she were unconscious. Imagine that instead of bone cancer, Wilma is in a terrible car accident and it puts her in a vegetative state so that she no longer has the mental capacity to make decisions for herself. In that case, the family would have to make the decision whether she lives or dies, provided that making such a decision is legal in the state of Iowa. And there is no issue in euthanasia of killing a patient against their will. That would still be murder, so that's not even a topic of discussion here. The case of the two dead grannies is the kind of case that makes Rachel's think that there's no difference between active or passive euthanasia. The granny killer grabs granny number one by the throat and chokes her. This is murder. This is morally wrong. But when the granny killer goes to the tub containing granny number two, he discovers she is already drowning by herself. He stays there and watches, but never lays a finger on Granny 2, nor does he try to help save her. He just watches her drown, but he didn't cause it, see? Now, was it really worse in the first case than the second? Or are they both equally morally bad? Think about it. Isn't it just as bad to let a child drown and do nothing to save that child as it is to murder a child? That's what Rachel thinks. Rachel's point: since letting Granny number 2 die is just as morally wrong as murdering Granny number 1, it follows that killing and allowing to die are morally equivalent. So, if it is morally permissible to allow dying patients to die, it is morally permissible to kill them. In other words, if passive euthanasia is morally permissible, then so is active. Since the state of Iowa allows Wilma to choose not to resuscitate in the event she starts dying, in other words, passive euthanasia, Rachel thinks it should also allow her to choose to get injected with extra morphine, active euthanasia. The reason is what we have just seen. He thinks that cases like the case that I gave of the 2 dead grannies show that there's no moral difference between letting someone die and actively taking their life. So if one is good, then the other is good. Rachel's argument. Premise 1. If you are in a circumstance in which it is okay to allow someone to die, then it is also okay to kill them. Premise 2. When it comes to dying patients, it is okay to let them die. Remember, passive euthanasia equals not pulling out all the stops to resuscitate them. Conclusion. Therefore, when it comes to dying patients, it is okay to kill them. Active euthanasia equals administering, for example, a lethal dose of morphine. So if passive is okay, Rachel says, then active is okay. Here's Rachel's argument in the form of an argument by analogy. Premise 1. Passive euthanasia is morally permissible. Premise 2. Passive euthanasia is morally equal to active euthanasia. Conclusion. Therefore, active euthanasia is morally permissible. They stand or fall together, Rachel thinks.
Just think about how we treat
pets.
In the case of pets, we don't distinguish between active and passive. In fact, we would be more likely to use active euthanasia because it would mean less suffering for the animal. So Rachel thinks we need to treat grandma more like we treat animals. Isn't it neat how we finish each other's sandwiches? That's good. We're like Hans and Anna in Frozen, the 2 of us.
The ethics flower blooms, then it grows.
This has been a Filmways presentation, darling.